Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is actually going to be about differential players, and specifically players who have less than 5% ownership. There are plenty of players, in my opinion, that actually, of course, are within 5 to 10% ownership that are still very, very good. But the idea that I've set myself here for this video is to look at anyone who's actually below 5%, just to actually identify people that aren't really featuring in many people's drafts so far. So the first pick that I actually have is someone, and you'll see that there is a recurring theme here with Brighton, with Solly March here. And Solly March is someone that we, of course, know famously for a disallowed goal last season. But the reality, of course, is that even though Mitoma is a completely template pick, and I completely think Mitoma is justifiable. In fact, he's my second favorite 6.5 mid at this point in time. March is a very, very close pick towards him. And you can see the underlying stats really don't favor Mitoma that much more. March practically has the same stats from an underlying perspective. The only fear, of course, with a team like Brighton is that they do have a lot of young talent, specifically that Roberto De Zerbi likes to use. And of course, that's something that affects, let's say, the forward position as well. But what we can expect, in my opinion, is once again March and Mitoma to be the leading wingers for this team, and specifically a little bit more rotation potentially in Europe. So I expect for March to actually play most of the games and actually start for Brighton. So that's what makes March such an appealing asset. He has a very large gulf in ownership compared to Mitoma, and I don't really think there's any reason to ignore it. He was someone who actually was a little bit more clinical when it comes down to, let's say, the actual goal output and the assist output compared to Mitoma. So if you wanted to take the argument, let's say that Mitoma is a little bit of a poor finisher, I mean, why not just go with March? The second asset that I'm looking at now is going to be João Pedro. And once again, recurring theme with Brighton. I actually think that he was the standout player so far for Brighton's preseason. We did see that Adringa actually got a brace in one of the recent games, but within the game that was versus Chelsea, and also just within moments of the previous Brentford game, you could actually see that João Pedro looks like an electric player. And what I do like about him is that he seems to be able to fit once again into the 10 spot and also the striker spot. A couple players within Brighton actually already occupy those spots, like in Undav, Ferguson, of course, more so the striker. But I do think actually the starting 10 for this team for Brighton should be João Pedro. And even if, let's say, he wasn't to start in the 10, there's still a good possibility that he starts in the striker position. And that's why I think he's a little bit more of a differential compared to someone like Ferguson, who might not actually have that many minutes because he can only really occupy the striker spot. So that's my opinion. I think João Pedro is a really good punt to look at. He may even also have penalties. What we saw within one of the matches, particularly the Chelsea match, was that João Pedro took the penalty. Now, of course, Gross was actually off the pitch. But one thing I would like to say is that Gross was actually the penalty taker under Graham Potter. And we've not actually seen anyone so far take penalties outside of McAllister under Roberto De Zerbi. So it does remain to be seen whether João Pedro remains as a potential penalty taker for Brighton, which would actually elevate him as an asset. So I do actually quite like João Pedro. And of course, at that sort of cut rate price of 5.5, nothing really compares within the midfield. And I actually think Enciso is actually directly affected by João Pedro, which is why I'm more interested in João Pedro for now. As far as the third asset, it's going to be Wisa at 6.0. I don't think Wisa will have penalties for Brentford, which is why, in my opinion, he's actually had quite a relatively low price, despite us all knowing that Tony's suspended until January. The big thing for me with Wisa is that he doesn't have the same sort of comparable underlying stats like a Tony did. Of course, Wisa, you can argue, is small sample size. He was ultimately a super sub. But what we often tend to see with super subs is that these types of players will actually get really good stats because, of course, they're playing versus a weakened version of an offense, and they're usually able to get really, really nice underlying stats. That's not necessarily the case with Wisa, but close to the end of the season when Tony was injured, Wisa actually had a fine run of games, and he was actually able to score in quite a few of them alongside Mbeumo. So if you don't want to go Mbeumo for whatever reason, you could go to Wisa. I personally I'm actually a huge fan of Mbeumo. This is not a situation where I think, let's say, March is comparable to Mitoma. I do think there's a bit of a gap between Mbeumo and Wisa, but I can understand going for Wisa if you really need to save that 0.5 in the bank. The next pick that I'm actually going for is within the defender position. This is going to be Colwill from Chelsea. And Colwill's an interesting one because with Chelsea, the biggest reason why he would start, in my opinion, is first of all, he is one of the electric sort of young prospects at the center back position. He's left-footed, which makes him, of course, a prime target for players. I feel like Man City are hoarding left center backs in their team, but across Europe, you don't have many top tier left center backs, and Colwill is one of those prospects. He just came off of winning the Euro U21 tournament, which I'm a little bit jealous of course, as I'm Spanish. But the big thing with Colwill too is when you look at Chelsea's depth right now, Badiashile is injured. He'll probably return at August 26th, but it'll actually take some time for him to actually find himself back within the team, and he may not even continue to start because of Colwill deposing him. With Thiago Silva, you're actually seeing that he's not getting many preseason minutes, which already maybe gives you a sign that Pochettino is favoring going for young centre-backs. Chalobah as well has been rumored to be actually transferred out of Chelsea. This hasn't happened right now, but of course, ultimately Chelsea are going to have to play two center backs, right? So I don't think Colwill is actually going to start the season with really any threats in his position. We did see Humphries actually play a young talent, of course, once again from Chelsea, who played in the previous match because Colwill had a knock, therefore missing the Newcastle game. But I do think Colwill will actually start the season, and he, in my opinion, is going to be a huge differential because a lot of us are actually looking at spending a little bit more money to go for someone like Chilwell. If you don't want to go for Chilwell, I don't actually mind the idea of going for Colwill as a 4.5 defender. I don't really like the double up, so you probably have to pick one or the other. As far as the next option, it's going to be Dan Burn. And one of the big reasons why people seem to be not so high on Botman, despite actually Botman being one of the higher owned defenders in the game, is the fact that if Newcastle have a bad run of games, and let's say some of the player base who are owning Botman because he was a good defender last season actually want to sell him, and therefore Botman is close to a price drop, then Botman might not be the pick that you want to go for game week 1 because you don't really want your team to actually lose value. But why not just go for Dan Burn instead? We've actually gotten rumors that Kieran Tierney, for example, from Arsenal would be joining Newcastle, but that transfer doesn't seem close to fruition. And I don't think there's actually that much depth available for Newcastle right now to actually, let's say, displace Dan Burn from the team. So Dan Burn's a great pick where you can actually get onto a Newcastle defender early. Maybe obviously use the 4.5 defender as sort of your 12th or 13th man. Not worry so much about game weeks 1 to 5. And after that, you've actually got a fantastic player for the second best defense last season at a very, very cheap price of 4.5 with hopefully no price drop. So that's why I quite like Dan Burn as an option. He would just be a long-term hold. The last option is going to be a goalkeeper in Sam Johnstone. And Johnstone's an interesting one. I feel like a lot of people actually think that Guaita might actually be able to play for Crystal Palace. But the key thing is, once you see Roy Hodgson joining this team, Guaita actually had only one start, and then Sam Johnstone has been pretty much the out-and-out keeper for every single match, and Guaita has actually been on the bench at various times, and he's also been out of the team. Another thing, of course, is Victor Guaita is actually 35 years old, or even 36, last I checked. I don't really see himself finding his way back into the team. There's nothing really based on Johnstone's performances, where he actually got quite a few clean sheets close to the end of last season. I think a lot of us will remember a specific free hit where he did incredibly well for us, but I think Johnstone will start for this Crystal Palace team. And in my previous video, when I did the 4.5 budget defenders, I said that none of the Crystal Palace defenders are interesting because their expected goal involvement was actually very poor. But the difference here, of course, with Johnstone is that doesn't really matter to him. He actually makes quite a lot of saves per 90, which of course is actually beneficial towards a goalkeeper as opposed to, let's say, beneficial for a 4.5 center back. So that's why I'm actually recommending Johnstone as a pick, as a hidden gem. And I do think he's actually slept on. In my opinion, I would still rate him as probably a top 2 4.5 million goalkeeper. I would still actually think that Flecken is the best one. I know a lot of people have said, based on the 2 preseason matches, that he's looked poor. And yes, of course, he's made a mistake or two. But I would say, of course, Brentford have a fantastic scouting department. He's actually had a good series of post-shot stopping performances in terms of advanced stats within the Bundesliga. So, the jury, of course, is still out on Flecken, and I would definitely not dismiss him over 2 games of football in the preseason. So, for now, I would say Johnstone is a very easy differential pick that I would go for if you wanted to opt for a 4.5 goalkeeper. And that's actually going to be it for the main body of the video. I've also done a little bit of a bonus here with Richarlison, who actually, if Kane leaves this Spurs team, he could actually be a fantastic option. We probably would expect for Son to be on penalties, but Richarlison as the starting striker for this team under a new manager, so hopefully a rejuvenated Richarlison. We've already seen him, of course, score a hat-trick in the preseason. Doesn't mean too much, of course, based on quality of opposition, but we know that Richarlison has been a capable striker in the past, and of course, if Kane is to leave, there's a lot of minutes for him to actually take on as the leading striker for Spurs, so I actually think he'd be a great option at 7.0 as a midfielder. Pedro Porro is an interesting one too. I think with Spurs, the issue that I have is I'm not 100% guaranteed that there will or won't be rotation. You've got Royale there who can still take minutes away from him, even though Pedro Porro is an interesting option too. But that's going to be it for the video. Let me know what your thoughts are. Do you like any other sub 5.0% players that you actually think people are sleeping on? And thank you guys so much for watching. So I'll see you guys in the next video.